Starmer, faced with a number of options and obstacles, seemed overwhelmed by the gravity of the decision and was routinely riposting to Reynolds and those in the room by saying, well, what's the correct answer? And it was one of those moments where actually Prime Minister, that's
on you.
That's on you.
Yeah. Now, Get In, the best-selling book by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund of The Times and Sunday Times, very much the Ant and Dec of political journalism in that they just keep winning all the awards, was the definitive account of Keir Starmer's rise to number 10 and the ruthless purge of the Labour Party led by the Irishman Morgan McSweeney. And it concluded with this question: having mastered the dark arts of getting in, does the Starmer team actually have a vision for what to do now they are there? Well, they've published a new edition of the book which attempts to answer that question with a new section called The Passive Premiership. And Patrick and Gabriel are both here to tell us all about it. Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
Good to have you both here, as always. That phrase then, the passive premiership, it comes from one of the senior officials who was waiting in vain for instructions. And you write that one of the definitive features of Starmer's Downing Street was kind of the deathly hush as Starmer sat for hours and hours studying papers as if he was still a barrister. Talk about people worried not just that they wouldn't get the right answer from him, but that they might not get any kind of answer at all. It's a really sort of striking image.
Yeah, so both of those vignettes, both the title of this postscript we've written, 14,000 words on the first year up to the budget, and your remark about Keir Starmer reading there, Hugo, are taken from a very senior official we were speaking to, and we spoke to dozens of people, both for the book and for this update. And one of the things we wanted to get a sense of was, what does Keir Starmer do all day? How does his government work? And several people made very similar remarks, which was remarks to the effect of, it's not a premiership where Boris Johnson bottles around the building, or you've got Gordon Brown sending furious emails at 4 a.m. in capital letters, 17-point font bolded up, saying, I've just read this amazing book by a Harvard economist. We must do something on, supply chain finance. It's not even Rishi Sunak, poring over everything available to him and shouting at officials saying the graph in this appendix is wrongly formatted and I want these statistics bottomed out, and here are 17 action points, and then we'll meet again next week. One person told us, Keir Starmer spends a lot of time, as you say, reading time is how it was put to us by one senior official. He reads
after snack time comes reading time.
Yeah, he sits there reading and
Sounds
reading
like
and
a nice
reading.
life.
Yeah, indeed. As if eventually, a bit like if you're a barrister, the right answer, the solution will present itself to you if you work hard enough at it. But it sort of mystified people, and that phrase, the passive premiership, it's an oddly passive premiership, someone said to us, and that, I think, it was the key that unlocked a lot of our understanding of how this first year has unfolded.
Especially because despite all that reading, the answer doesn't always come. You describe in quite remarkable detail what happened in April when MPs had to pass emergency legislation to allow the government to take control of the Scunthorpe steel plant to stop it from closing. And Starmer himself just had no opinion at all about whether he needed to do that.
That's right. The business secretary at the time, Johnny Reynolds, was contemplating invoking the Civil Contingencies Act to... he was going to. There was some conversation about recalling Parliament, nationalising British Steel, and engaging in essentially, throwing the kitchen sink at keeping the blast furnaces on. And it was one of those moments where the blast furnaces, if they are permitted to go off, they can't come back on, and
they melt down. Yeah,
and in the event, Starmer, faced with a number of options and obstacles, seemed overwhelmed by the gravity of the decision and was routinely riposting to Reynolds and those in the room by saying, well, what's the correct answer? And it was one of those moments where actually Prime Minister, that's
on you.
That's on you.
Yeah.
And I think, I suppose, the Thomas Cromwell of our book, the anti-hero, the protagonist, is Morgan McSweeney. And I think that a thesis which kind of emerges from our postscript is that perhaps it was a category error for the Labour Party, certainly the mass ranks of the SPAD class and a number of ministers too, to assume that as well as transforming the party, engaging in all the internal organising and reform, he could separately govern. There's this lovely moment where he, I think, shortly after the government's U-turn on winter fuel, told two people over dinner, I need help, I'm drowning. This was a man who essentially felt like he was like Atlas bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he could not single-handedly overcome some of the personality flaws or defects that lay in Starmer as Prime Minister. And in the end, we did say our sort of final sentence of the book amounted to the idea that Starmer's McSweeney's project had failed. He hadn't in actual fact left, but I think by the time we wrote it, it was an inevitability that he would.
Well, let's go back to those first months in power when the government's the honeymoon period, as it were, seemed to just be wasted on a war between McSweeney and Sue Gray. And look, everyone's often asked how it can be that they weren't prepared for power, having anticipated it so keenly. Looking back now, was that Sue Gray? Was it McSweeney? Was it Starmer himself and his lack of interest in anything other than, well, anything?
Look, it was all three, and I think Gabriel used the phrase category error. There was a definite category error, and it comes back to how Starmer conceives of his job, does his job, conceives of politics itself. The idea that you could neatly divide, okay, some of the guys do politics over there, I do the administration, and someone will prepare a programme for government, and I'll work really hard at that, and then the political guys, I'll say any other business, what's the politics of this, and then the orchestra will swell, and Labour are re-elected. Politics clearly doesn't work like that, because you have to apply political judgment to everything that happens. It comes back to the Johnny Reynolds point, right? It's not like sort of Keir Starmer was saying, well, hang on, can we trigger the Civil Contingencies Act? To which Johnny Reynolds said, well, it doesn't really matter if we can or not. If you want to save virgin steelmaking in the UK, you tell us that. That is the political judgment you have to make, and then we'll find a way to do it. It's not a sort of like, can we do this legal processology thing? Yes, no.
He wants a multiple choice question.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it doesn't help that the civil service often submit their submissions with the options in that format. But the question you ask, I think, is the crucial one, right? Clearly, and I think everyone admits this now, not enough serious preparation for government, coordinated preparation for government was done. A lot of that was down to Sue Gray's management, leadership style, how closely she hoarded things, became a bottleneck, etc. But let's not pretend that Sue Gray being over there, engrossed in that sort of stuff, didn't suit people like Morgan McSweeney, because it meant they had their fiefdom, they controlled the politics, and there were lots of people who basically, as soon as Sue Gray arrived, thought this isn't going to work. How do we basically constructively dismiss her? And the prep for government going badly, or the first weeks of government going badly, was made the case that she had to go. But who set up that weird double-headed hydra of political administration? It was Keir Starmer. So everybody bears a share of the blame, but the buck stops with the principal ultimately.
Tell me a bit about the relationship between Starmer and Rachel Reeves, because there are in some extent a double act, like Blair Brown or Cameron and Osborne, but they seem to sort of come up quite short against both of those.
I think they do come up short for the straightforward reason that theirs was purely a partnership born of circumstance and of mutual benefit. It's not like, for instance, the ultimate template for these relationships in Labour's contemporary history is between Blair and Brown, and they shared a parliamentary office, and Brown schooled Blair in the history of the party and in the traditions of the Labour movement, and they were a kind of intellectual and political double act. That is so distinct. In Starmer's instance, he initially appointed Annalise Dodds, remember her, as his Shadow Chancellor after they shared a convivial car journey during the 2020 leadership campaign. And he alighted on Reeves because she had endeared herself, not to Starmer himself per se, but certainly to a number of people in his parliamentary office, because she had the political foresight and wherewithal to whip the parliamentary party into voting for Boris Johnson's Brexit deal after the 2019 election. So Starmer on that basis was content to appoint her as Shadow Chancellor. But I suppose, what are the preconditions for a relationship of depth and substance between the occupants of number 10 and 11? Well, one you would say would be a shared political project. Nobody could accuse I mean, some people don't think Starmer himself has a political project, not least now that he's shorn of McSweeney, so they don't have that. They don't have much history together. There was a solidity to their dynamic before the general election. I think what's so remarkable now is Reeves has for so long been in office but not in power. Obviously, Starmer finds himself in that predicament too. But Reeves, as Patrick was saying on our podcast a few moments ago, appeared at the dispatch box twice over the last fortnight. That is a record by recent times. The extent to which her political standing has been diminished in such a short space of time means it's quite hard to reach for any parallel in terms of the dynamic between them. But I suppose, the big thing, and I suppose the thesis that animates our book, which we don't claim to be particularly prescient, because it is obvious to anybody who studies him in detail, but it ends up being the key to answering any question, is that obviously Starmer himself isn't gripped by a big idea or any sense of political economy.
Because that's the problem. The Blair-Brown relationship was tempestuous because it was defined by mutual challenge. You would have number 10 coming back to the Treasury and saying, we're not sure that tax change is progressive, or we want to do this, and you had number 11 coming back and saying, no, that's mental, we have to do this instead, or we can't possibly raise tax on this, or levy this change or that change. There's a vignette in the book about, and what's the original sin of this government is the winter fuel allowance cut. That just goes to Keir Starmer. He looks at it and goes, okay, that's the problem.
Because there's no there's no ideology there. There's no heft. There's nothing. There's no guns he can bring to that fight. Look, let's. I want to talk about another episode that illustrates his lack of curiosity, which was the appointment of a man not unknown to this very studio, which was Peter Mandelson. You say McSweeney was in constant contact with Mandelson for years, had been for years, but the Prime Minister didn't speak to him either before or after his appointment as US Ambassador. That's astonishing.
The first comment Keir Starmer makes, directly to or about Peter Mandelson, that Peter Mandelson is aware of during that process, is the quote in the press release that says, Peter Mandelson, great guy, great to have him as ambassador. Right?
They don't have a chat. They don't have a kind of, hey Peter, we're thinking about you for this job. Come in and have a chat about it.
From our reporting, that did not happen, which is pretty remarkable, isn't it? But again, is revealing of the way the project is set up, right? You have whole swathes of people who never deal with the principle, don't know the principle, but come to be doing incredibly important, and in this case, consequential. And not that his tenure as ambassador was destructive, but the aftermath has been pretty destructive for the government. And they're not close to Keir Starmer. They don't like Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, quite openly doesn't like them, and yet all of a sudden they are at the centre of the whole setup.
I think we should say, just in terms of the kind of personal stories at the heart of this, it is the darkest irony that McSweeney's path into politics was at the town hall level in Lambeth, which he dragooned back from a Lib Con coalition, but which at one point had been in the hands of the far left. And the essence of McSweeney's politics was that under the far left, under the leadership of Ted Knight, a bit of a bogeyman of the tabloid press in his day, there had been this child abuse scandal that had ravaged the lives in particular of young black children in social services within the precincts of this London borough. And on that basis, he said the exoticism and ideology of the left blinds its advocates to what is going on the ground. And it is remarkable that in the end, the seeds of McSweeney's departure, possibly Starmer's long-term destruction, was sown in relation to the appointment of Mandelson. Obviously, Starmer appoints McSweeney in order to see round corners. He couldn't see round that corner, possibly because of the depth of his personal relationship with Mandelson, who, by the way, in our first book, I think is one of the first times McSweeney's name was mentioned in public. He said, I don't know who created Morgan McSweeney, but whoever they are has their place in heaven, something along those lines. I mean, it was a proper relationship defined by personal and political mutual admiration, and in any event, Starmer was the one who, because of McSweeney's relationship, had to be able to see around that corner, and insofar as he didn't have a single conversation with the man in question, it is possibly inevitable that he didn't do so.
Should we assume that if McSweeney was still there today, the release of all the Mandelson emails, which we think could begin this week, would put paid to that?
I think that don't just look at the departure of Morgan McSweeney, look also at the self-defenestration of Tim Allen, his Starmer's short-lived director of communications. I think there are a number of people who probably concluded it just wasn't worth waiting for the inevitable. Wes Streeting made the same determination when he proactively divulged his correspondence. It is one of those things where the pendulum has swung so dramatically in terms of the mood in Westminster on Mandelson, but you cannot overstate the centrality and significance of his role, especially in a kind of embryonic Starmer project. A lot of the dog days of Corbyn's leadership and the early days of Starmer's leadership were spent huddled around the kitchen table of Lord Liddell, Mandelson's former flatmate and co-conspirator, it was around those tables that McSweeney, Matthew Doyle, later Starmer's director of communications, Wes Streeting, a number of people break bread and contemplated whether it was possible to save the Labour Party. So, I mean, the fact that...
And also for Keir Starmer, whether Keir Starmer was any good or not, actually, is the other thing.
The conclusion tended to be not really.
Turning to now, right now, with all those people having gone, McSweeney having gone, and with Starmer having no strategy of his own that anyone can discern, what happens now? Can the government survive with that strategy, just being sort of bouncing from one crisis to another, one U-turn to another?
Well, look, we'll find out in May. I mean, I think we share the view that one of the funniest and most, but both, it's a great quote in that it's both funny and illuminating in this new postscript to the book, is a description of where power now lies in the Labour Party. And in our first book, an acolyte of Morgan Sweeney, one of Keir Starmer's advisors, said, Keir Starmer thinks he's driving the train, but we've sat him at the front of the DLR, which, as listeners who are not in London may not know, is a driverless train that winds its way through the Docklands of East London.
And it can be a lot of fun sitting at the front of the DLR.
Yeah, exactly.
Pretend.
Yeah, indeed, and pretending to drive. And, we, I think, get a text every fortnight from a random person saying, look, I'm Keir Starmer, I'm on the front of the DLR. But as somebody said to us, Lucy Powell, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, great organiser of Labour's sort of soft left, of the dispossessed and never possessed of Starmerism, sacked from the cabinet, wrongly, if you wanted to survive with your Keir Starmer. I think, in my view, it's clear now. Somebody said Lucy Powell has replaced Morgan as the controller of the DLR train. And while there are many other people who ought to be mentioned in that sense, I think the essential dynamic is right. A different group of people is now taking the view that Keir Starmer surviving, Keir Starmer being in charge, is the best way to prosecute their version of Labour politics. And all that dynamic hasn't changed. Keir Starmer's style hasn't changed. The emphasis and substance of what he's saying might have changed, but the dynamic that the politics are coming from elsewhere and Keir Starmer is a cipher for them is the thing that's changed. And that will persist until this group of people decides, OK, this ain't going to work, because they're the people who are keeping him in power now.
News keeps happening. History keeps happening. Even since you finished you finished this new chapter to the book, there's a war, and the relationship that Keir Starmer has with Donald Trump seems to have changed, perhaps irrevocably, perhaps not, because one never knows. But does that give Starmer a new sense of? Could that give Starmer a new sense of purpose? The kind of the national leader in that kind of time of crisis.
So I'd say at the outset, I spoke to one of Starmer's strategists at Labour Party conference last year, and their position at that point was that Starmer's public standing had sort of calcified. The early sleaze scandals, the Winterfuel, the U-turn after U-turn, essentially the public's perception of him had frozen. It was unlikely to change until something big came along. If that thing didn't happen, then Starmer's standing would remain unchanged. But there are those moments from time to time. Ukraine, for a brief period, provided a reprieve to Boris Johnson. The Second Lebanon War actually did for Tony Blair in terms of his relationship with the Parliamentary Labour Party. But events, especially in the Middle East, can lead to a politician being recast, both in the popular imagination and possibly within their own party. Starmer has, notwithstanding all the criticism of not being sufficiently fleet-footed when it came to defending British interests, he has found himself broadly on the right side of public opinion, in that, the perception, at least so far, seems to be that it is a war of choice, and it's not a choice that much of the British public would have made. What it does do as well is it totally upends every calculation that had previously underpinned his approach towards a special relationship. Previously, he had understood that his own political fortunes were bound up with his ability to foster a good relationship with Donald Trump. When he actually extracted an exemption from Trump's tariffs, Starmer headed straight to the Jaguar Land Rover factory in Solihull in order to illustrate, through his own present what that relationship meant. Now we're in a weird world where Starmer is possibly able to revert to, whoever the real Keir Starmer is. We assume he's a guy who isn't much keen on Donald Trump, and that may now bear fruit for him politically.
No, we've got to leave it there. But Get In is available to order at the Times Bookshop, where Times Plus members can get a 20% discount. Just visit timesbookshop.co.uk. Patrick Maguire, Gabriel Pogrund, thank you very much indeed. And anyone who hasn't bought it yet, lucky you get to buy it now.
And it's cheaper in paperback as well. So
well, there you go.